All right, so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum. Okay, everybody, open up your sketchbooks, and we have a few notes to take today, and then we'll be finished. So we're going to end this semester, we're going to end this year by talking about the Nazi art theft. The Nazi party came to power in 1933, and they almost immediately started stealing art. In 1938, they made a law that all Jews must report any property of value over $2,000 in today's money, and this included the art that they had in their possession. You can see in this illustration right here that the German officers are ransacking this couple's house looking for anything of value over $2,000. They're just going to take it with them. I want to introduce you to this guy right here in the center of this photograph. This is Joseph Goebbels, spelled Goebbels. I think it's pronounced Goebbels. And he is the administrator for the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Basically, he's the propaganda arm of the Nazi Party, and he's also in charge of all the cultural property of the Nazi Party, which means all the art. He's in charge of all the art. In 1907, the Hague Convention, one of the rules that they came out with in this convention is that they clearly forbids any seizure of cultural property during wartime. So when one army is stomping all over another country, that they're not allowed to take any art or destroy any art or anything of cultural significance. Do you think the Nazis went by that? This map right here shows you the scope of how far the Germans advanced during World War II. You can see Germany, let me get my laser pointer. This is Germany here in the center in yellow. These are the Axis powers. And Germany went as far as France on the western part of Europe. And then they made it almost to Moscow, going into Russia. And everywhere that they went, they stole the art that they found. If they found it in museums, they took it. If they found it in homes, they took it. If they found it in galleries or public buildings, they took it. And all of this art gets sent back to Germany. Let me make a correction there. Most of the art went back to Germany. What they didn't send back to Germany, they tried to sell. And when they were selling it at a very, very low cost just to try to get rid of it. But nobody wants to buy stolen art, right? It's just not good. Also, if you're in possession of stolen art, later on somebody will, like a government will come by and take it from you because you're in possession of stolen goods. All right, I want you to write this down. The ERR, that stands for Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sure I'm butchering it. But this was a Nazi Party organization dedicated to appropriating cultural property during the Second War. This is the administration that's in charge of stealing art and categorizing it, cataloging it, and sending it back to Berlin. And here's a couple of photographs of members of the ERR. But it was one of the largest Nazi art looting task forces operating throughout occupied Europe. And I've got some photographs during the war of, you can see the Nazis presenting a painting that was taken from a museum. And then here's a couple photographs of the museums at the time of the Second World War. And as the German army was getting closer and closer, they decided to get rid of their art so that the Germans couldn't steal it. So I want to show you this right here. This is a stretcher frame for a very large painting, which I'm going to guess was a history painting right here. And then you see over here is a bunch of empty frames. So they're taking the canvases off of the stretcher frames. They're taking the canvas out of the frames because they're easier to hide. They're easier to transport that way. You can take a canvas off and roll it up, and then it's easier to try to move rather than a 10-foot tall, 20-foot wide painting. And over here, you can see that they've taken the art off of the walls, and on the floor are a bunch of empty frames. And not only are they trying to hide the artwork, but they're trying to protect the artwork from bombing. As you know, during total war, there's lots of bombers flying overhead, dropping bombs indiscriminately. And so you guys remember Nike of Samothrace from last semester. She stands at the top of the staircase. And during the war, they made a special ramp down the staircase and a special crate to put her in, and they rolled her down this staircase to the basement so that she wouldn't get bombed. I want you to write down this building right here. Is the Jeu du Paume Museum. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm butchering it. This art museum was emptied before the Germans entered Paris in 1940. And during the French surrender, the Germans occupied France for 4 years and exploited France's cultural treasures. So during the Vichy regime, the ERR took over this museum building, and the ERR used this space to store masterpieces that it had taken from all over Europe. And it became the most important and the biggest processing center for all the objects looted by the Germans. It's estimated that between 20,000 and 40,000 objects of artworks were delivered to this museum and then processed and then shipped out to the Reich, the Third Reich, or to Berlin. In this photograph on the left and this cartoon on the right, it shows how the Nazis used moving crates and moving trucks. So while they were in control of Paris, they commandeered moving company vehicles to move the art into the museum and then out of the museum once it had been processed onto trains going to Berlin. So they put the art in the crates and they used a Parisian moving companies to move the art around. All right. Now I want you to write down this lady's name, Rose Valland. Valland. She was the curator of the museum before the Nazis came to Paris. And the Nazis kept her on to help them. I know, right? They're right up to the door. To help them process the artwork. But what she was really doing, she was secretly taking notes of all the Nazi movement, and she secretly collaborated with the French resistance. The intention was to track what the Nazis did with the stolen paintings at a great personal risk. If she was discovered, she and her collaborators would have been executed. So she recorded every detail of the incoming and outgoing shipments, sometimes sneaking into the Nazi office at night and photographing important documents. She also documented the fate of the pieces that passed through the museum, where the art was going, who received them, and she would commit to memory all these facts while at work and then go home and write them down. She hid her documents, and she made detailed maps of the extensive network of Nazi transportation and storage facilities. After the war, her notes led to the recovery of many artworks, and she was given the French National Legion of Honor Award. So she's the most decorated woman in French history. All right, I also want to tell you about the Monuments Men. By the end of the war, 20% of all art was in Nazi possession. So the Allies came up with this group. They established this group called the Monuments Men. These are 400 men from 13 countries, and their job was to enter newly liberated towns and assess the damage done to the culture. If possible, they were to stop artworks from being destroyed and stop looting by the Allies. There was a recent movie made about them. But here's some photographs of some of the artwork that they recovered. And you guys recognize this one down here? Yeah, it's the lady with the ermine. That painting was stolen by the Nazis and then rescued by the Monuments Men. A lot of art was hidden in these mountain castles by the Nazis. And if you look at the photograph of the inside, can you see that stack of art up here? All these paintings stacked up on top of each other? It's got to damage all of them. Like, you just can't stack paintings like that. And then you have crates of artworks and valuable objects over here. And this is a man right here that gives you a sense of how large this cache is. They would also put artworks in the salt mines. This is the entrance to a salt mine in Austria. So inside the salt mines, the Nazis created these like these shelves, and this time the artwork was taken care of a lot better. These artworks are stored vertically, which causes them less damage, and also salt preserves things. You ever notice that like canned food is really salty, and that's to keep it fresher longer. So that's one of the things that salt does. So over 12,000 works of art were found in the salt mines. Now, I told you about the German side of this massive art theft. Let me tell you about the Russian side. Over here is Germany, and this is the German push into Russia. All of this is Russia. This white line right here is the border of Russia, and this is how far the Germans got. They got almost all the way to Moscow and Leningrad and then Stalingrad. The Nazi invasion of Russia was brutal. The Nazis believed that the Russians were of an inferior race. They had no problem with burning churches and books, and they destroyed 427 churches, 4,000 libraries, and destroyed 110 million books. Stalin created a administration called the Extraordinary State Commission, and they kept a list of everything that the Nazis did. I've talked to you guys about deaths in war before, but this is a World War II deaths chart. And then look up at the amount of people that died. Who got it the worst? Soviet Union, and by a long shot. If you look at the United States, how many deaths in World War II? There is the United States. It's barely just a blip on this chart. Each of these numbers represents millions. So almost 24 million Russians died. The red represents combat deaths, and the orange represents civilian deaths. And the civilian deaths are all at the hands of the Germans. So the Germans the Russians are pissed off at the Germans. I mean, really pissed off. All right, and they want to get revenge. So at the end of the war, in the last days of the war, the Allies are closing in on Germany here in Berlin. England, America, and France are coming in from the west, and Russia is coming in from the east. So the Allies were on a race to who could get to Berlin first. But all the Allies made not a truce, but an agreement. They were going to let Russia get Berlin. So over here you can see this is the U.S. Army, and there's also the French and the British. They were all told to stop at this line right here, and then let the Russians take Berlin. And you can see all these red arrows over here. This is the Russians surrounding Berlin and eventually taking Berlin. One of the most famous of the photos to come from World War II is this guy swinging the hammer and sickle above the Reichstag. At the end of the war, the different allies occupied different parts of Germany to guard and monitor. Within months of the fall of the Third Reich, thousands of troops were fanning out across Soviet-occupied zone, and that's thousands of Russian troops. And they established what was called trophy brigades. And they were packing up artworks to send to Moscow. Basically, the Soviets did to the Germans what the Germans did to everybody else. They stole their art. Remember I was telling you about all the art that the Germans were selling, they were stealing, and then packing them up in crates and cataloging them and sending them back to Berlin. All they were doing was organizing it for the Russians to take it. The trophy brigades were not only stealing German art, but also the art that the Germans stole and sent to Berlin. And then the Soviet troops were sending the artwork back to Moscow. In July of 1945, a military plane from Berlin landed at Moscow's airport. On board was an extraordinary cargo, 7 large crates addressed to the Committee of Arts of the Council of the People's Commissars of the USSR. This was only the beginning. Planes began flying nonstop. In the crates were famous artworks by famous artists. An estimated 2.5 million artworks and 10 million books and manuscripts were believed to have been sent to Moscow. A rough estimate puts the value of the trove at $6.4 billion. Once in Soviet hands, the Nazi war bounty effectively disappeared. They were hidden away. Then begins the Cold War. During the Cold War, America and Europe keeps asking the Soviet Union, hey, all that artwork you stole, that belongs to us, send it back. And the Soviets, the Russians are saying, what artwork? What are you talking about? So for decades, the Soviet officials denied having the art. After the wall fell, the Russians admitted that they had it. And they admitted to the trophy brigades, and they admitted to taking it, and they admitted to hiding it. So is this theft or is this restitution? It depends on who you talk to. Most legal scholars would agree that the Soviet Union definitely violated the 1907 Hague Agreement, which clearly forbids the seizure of cultural property during wartime. The Russians view it differently. When the Germans invaded Russia, Germans wiped out 30 Russian cities from the face of the earth. The Germans pillaged hundreds of museums and reduced them to ashes. And the Russians, basically their question is, who will compensate us for these losses? And the Russians are saying, now the artworks are part of the Russian culture. In the years after World War II, Germany and Russia have come close to returning some of the artwork to Germany. But each time the Russians change their mind and keep the art, claiming it's theirs now. There was one instance during the Cold War that Russia gave some of the artwork back. So they gave about 1.5 million artworks back, and they sent it to Berlin. But in 1955 to 1958, Berlin was in control of the Soviet Union. So they're sending it back to themselves, is what they were doing. One of those artworks was the Pergamon Museum, which had the altar of Zeus, if you remember that from the first semester. Does anybody have any questions? Any comments? All right. I appreciate you guys taking this class, and we are done.